Hello, Nick. It's a pleasure to have you here with us in the Moscow Center of Consciousness in Moscow.
Thank you so much for bringing me here.
Yeah. So the first question is about your coming to philosophy and to science. So why did you decide to become a scientist and not an artist or maybe not a fiction writer? Your writing
is different.
Yeah. Well, your writing is extremely creative. It's you were a recipient of book awards, and it seems that you have a passion for art and wanted to make a very personal contribution, and still you became a scientist.
Dimitri, I think I wanted to make a personal contribution within science, and so I think there's a lot of overlap in terms of motivation and the kinds of issues which I've drifted towards. They've been areas where my own contribution could possibly make a big difference, partly because of the way I express it and the poetry and the language which I choose to use to explain these concepts. I actually began in much more hard-nosed science as a neuroscientist working on the brain of monkeys. And I made some of the first single-cell recordings from the brains of monkeys and rats. It was, hard-edged physiology. And I felt it was an extraordinary thing to be involved in research like that. But one thing that struck me from the beginning was that I didn't really need to be doing this. Someone else will do it if I don't. The problems of understanding cells in the monkey's brain and so on are right there in front of us, and the kinds of answers which we get, even if the techniques have to be designed, the answers are going to be ones which any other good scientist would arrive at if they made the same study. And from that, I moved fairly slowly, I suppose, to, in a sense, softer subjects, which involved more of a contribution from myself. I worked on monkey aesthetics at one point. I then went out and did field work in Africa. And as a result of that, and working with Diane Fossey on mountain gorillas, I came back with a completely new sense of what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in an area where my answers would look different from other people's. And so I moved into working on the question of the evolution of, firstly, of the human mind and brain as such, but in particular, the evolution of consciousness. And I think it's still clear that if you look at all the possible solutions which are being presented, whether it's David Chalmers or Dan Dennett or mine, I would, if I can class mine along with theirs, have the stamp of a particular intellectual and personal history on them. And as you say, I like to draw on literature and on poetry and on paintings because, well, partly because they provide such wonderful metaphors, but also, maybe we can talk about this later, actually because I think that consciousness is a work of art.
But you are also philosopher as well as psychologist. And what is it like to be a philosopher and psychologist at the same time?
It's very nice of you to call me a philosopher. I wouldn't dare do so myself. I mean, of course, I am a scientist by training, and I've never done a philosophy course in my life. But I've often made the point in writing about the evolutionary history of consciousness that which I think one of its roles has been to enable us to understand other human beings. And I've used the term natural psychologist, that human beings have evolved to be psychologists by nature. Now, I think in the same way, we've evolved to be philosophers by nature. It's very deep in us.
In 1981, you delivered a lecture called 4 Minutes to Midnight, and you spoke about the deliberate blindness towards the arms race, nuclear arms race. How did you come from the study of blindsight and blindness of the monkeys to the issues of what you call the aboriginal blindness or the deliberate blindness of the population towards the arms race?
Well, I mean, the words are the same, and I suppose you might think that it must have been my studies of blindness which led me on to that. I don't think truly that's the case. I think that, I mean, since I was young, I'd been involved in issues of international politics and questions to do with war and peace, because my family brought me up that way. I mean, from the age of 10, we were going on marches, famous Aldermaston marches to the site for nuclear weapons research in Britain. So, these issues remained very important to me, but and became even more important as the world became an ever more dangerous place in the 70s and 80s. And it wasn't just me, of course. In fact, I'd say for a couple of years, my department of animal behavior in Cambridge basically closed down. We all went and decided the most important thing now, apart from our teaching and so on, the thing we have to address is the question of the arms race. Robert Hine, my professor there, for example, was and still is spending a lot of his life on trying to avert nuclear disaster. So I think we saw that as being the central issue of our time.
As a young psychologist, you were studying the blindsight, the effect of the capacity of vision after the lesion of the visual cortex. So, so can you tell us a little bit more about the discovery, the monkey Helen maybe, but also about the importance of that discovery for the studies of consciousness?
Which I was very fortunate in a way. I was in the right place at the right time. I was a research student just beginning in Cambridge University, and in the laboratory, my supervisor, Larry Weisskranz, had some monkeys who had 3 of them actually, which had had the back of the brain removed in order to look at the effect on vision. It was his research, not mine. What Weisskranz had effectively established was what many people would have said they already knew, which was if you remove the visual cortex, it's where the eyes project to the back of the brain, the monkey, just like a human being in similar circumstances, becomes completely blind. And so it, in fact, seemed with these monkeys of Weisskranz's, they would sit just dejectedly, not even bothering to look around, and it was obvious that something really was missing from their lives, no evidence of vision at all. But I had my own reasons for wondering if this should be the case, partly because I'd been doing, as I mentioned earlier, some electrophysiology, and I'd recorded from another part of the visual system, which is called the superior colliculus in the midbrain, and found there cells which are very acutely, finely tuned for visual information, and yet they're not changed when you remove the visual cortex. So possibly those could be a secondary system which could provide sight even when the visual cortex is gone. Well, my professor went to a meeting in Switzerland, and while he was away, I took the opportunity to come and interact with his monkeys, one of them in particular, who was obviously a very special animal, as we'll discover later. So this monkey, she was called Helen. I sat with her and played with her, tried to get her to engage with me. She was, otherwise, I didn't have any interest in the world, but I played with her, I offered her bits of apple, and then I would tease her and take them away, and so on. Within, I think it's true to say, a few hours, it was clear she wasn't as blind as everybody said she was. And so 2 days later, I'd actually got her reaching out and touching a stick if I held it up and twiddled it. It had a kind of pattern on the end. You can see some of this on the video, which is available online. And so I was very excited. I sent a telegram to Larry Weisskranz. That's what we did back in the 1960s, no email. He came back from Basel, apparently rather cross. I said, Larry, look, you must see. I told you about it. Come and look and see what's going on with Helen. And he said, well, no time today. I mean, maybe tomorrow we can do that. I said, come on, Larry, we'll get a paper into Nature. This is very, very surprising. He came and he looked again, and of course he had to recognize that this monkey was not blind in the way which people had imagined she had to be. And so, in fact, we did rush a paper into Nature a month later. But the main consequence for my own involvement was that Larry decided not to kill this animal. And normally, in these experiments, after you've done your tests, you then kill the animal, you sacrifice it, is the usual word, and then you investigate the brain and so on, see what's missing, what exactly was the lesion. Well, Weisskranz said, no, okay, it's over to you now. see where you can go with this. And so, in fact, I was able to take this monkey with me when I moved to Oxford, and then I moved back to Cambridge. And over 7 years, I worked with her very closely in a kind of intimacy, which is almost, it's hard to explain, really. She wasn't a pet animal, ever, but we got to know each other, I should say, quite well. And because of that, she allowed me to work with her in ways, I think, which were almost unknown in that kind of situation, human-monkey experiments. And as I say, she went to Oxford with me, she came back to Cambridge, and all the time her vision seemed to be improving. When I was back in the animal behavior laboratory in Cambridge, this was not a psychology department, this was a department mostly for doing research on animal behavior in the wild. And there I met a young French woman, Mireille Bertrand, who she was interested to know about this work I was doing with Helen. And then she saw that all the testing I was doing had Helen sitting in a cage, reaching out to touch things or to choose things and so on. She said, look, this is crazy. This is a wild animal. Let's give her some freedom. I mean, she should be a wild animal. And I said, what are you talking about? She couldn't manage outside the cage. And anyway, she would be scared out of her life once she had got out of the cage by accident, and she rushed around the room, clutching at things, bumping into them and so on. Mireille said, okay, you say she can't manage outside the cage, leave it to me. And I watched through the window into the animal room. Mireille opened the cage. Helen kind of fell out of it, panicked, grabbed at Mireille, tried to scratch her. Mireille pinned her arms back. She knelt on her. She slapped her face. She bit her. 20 minutes later, Helen had become a pet. She was completely changed by that experience. I think people say the same thing about training horses sometimes. You have to break them in. Anyhow, whatever was happening, we now had a new Helen to deal with, and it allowed me then to leave the laboratory. I put a lead on her. I would walk her through the village outside Cambridge. You're not allowed to do that anymore, I should say, because of health and safety regulations. But anyway, through that, it gave her, of course, much more opportunity to discover what she was capable of. And before long, she was climbing trees, and she also now had a visual world which extended more than 3 feet, because she could interact with things by moving towards them much further away. Anyway, the upshot was of all that she went on recovering her vision to the point at which you wouldn't have known that she had anything wrong with her. Dan Dennett and I once showed a film of this monkey Helen to a seminar in Columbia University in philosophy, and we introduced it by saying, look, we're going to show you some film now. I won't say why we're showing it to you. And then showed the film of Helen, and then asked the students, faculty, why have we shown you this film? I mean, is there anything special about that monkey? No, ordinary monkey, isn't she? And then we said, there's every reason to think that in some way her vision is nothing like ours, because she has no visual cortex. She's not blind, as you see, but there's something strange about it. Anyhow, as I say, I got to know this animal very well, and so I spent a great deal of time trying to work out, to use that phrase, what it's like to be her. What's going on in her head when she sees. And something, it was clear that it wasn't a case of normal vision in the phenomenal sense anyway. I found it hard to put my finger on what it was, but it seemed that she didn't have any confidence in her own ability to see. She didn't understand that she could see. If she became frightened, for example, even at the very end, she would suddenly become blind again. She'd crash around and knock into things. So it was as if she could see, but she couldn't. She still didn't appreciate what basis there could be for her seeing. I wrote a paper then called Seeing and Nothingness, in which I suggested that actually, if we want to take this further, we're going to have to find new ways of talking about vision, because there will be ways in which you can maybe use visual information, but there won't be ways in which we would understand them as being accompanied by the sensations of seeing. That's why, as Dimitri asked the question, why has this become such an important issue for philosophy? Because it drives a wedge between phenomenal experience and behavioral capacities.
In respect to qualia, we were talking about the phenomenal consciousness. In respect to qualia, philosophers usually fall into two categories. It's either realists or illusionists. There are philosophers that think that qualia are real and require an explanation. And some other philosophers think that qualia is logically inconsistent and don't exist. So, and there's only a false belief about the special subjective phenomenal qualities. So you seem to belong to the second camp. But in your recent paper, you suggest that the notion of consciousness, the notion of illusion, can be replaced with a better concept, which is art, as you mentioned. Is this just a terminological proposal, or is there substantial, important difference?
Well, it is, in a way, it's only a matter of words. Sorry. In a way, it's just a matter of words of reframing the solution which we're talking about. But I think it could be a very important political step in the discipline of our subject, because I think people quite rightly get upset with the idea that consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is an illusion. It seems to disparage it. It's as if in that case, oh, okay, it can't be of any value to us really, and we ought to learn not to have this illusion. I mean, Paul Churchland, for example, is always arguing, okay, we're continually letting our folk psychological concepts get in the way of the reality, and if qualia are an illusion, that's again something we should eliminate from the science of consciousness. I don't think that's true at all. I mean, Dmitry, you just said qualia don't exist. That's perhaps not quite the right way to put it. Qualia, of course they exist. We're all living in the presence of these qualia, but they don't refer to anything in the outside world, anything that physically exists in the outside world. Nothing material could have the qualities of qualia, which we attribute to them. So there must be, in a sense, inventions on our own part. We're responding to something going on in our heads, in our brains, to which we then attribute these remarkable, miraculous, phenomenal qualities. So first thing I've argued just recently in that Scientific American paper is let's at least make this gesture to reach out to the realists and the people who hate to hear consciousness described as an illusion, and offer them the alternative way of putting it. Okay, yes, maybe consciousness is an illusion and it's an invention, but it's a work of art, and we are the artists. Just like, Picasso, his canvases are illusory. He's presenting the world not as it really is, but as it might be in some kind of way in which, of course, not only isn't real, but couldn't be real. But his role is to, of course, is to present it that way in order to transform the way we ourselves see who we are and what the world outside is. But I think that we were the first artists here, long before the Cubists or any others started trying to present the world in strange ways in order to tell us about the truth about ourselves. I think that nature has designed us to be artists of consciousness and at the same time connoisseurs of consciousness. We create this illusion, and then we ourselves, this work of art, and we ourselves are the audience for it. You asked, is it going to be helpful beyond the level of metaphor? Well, I think when I myself thought, well, okay, let's try this out, it did actually it opened my eyes to perhaps new ways of seeing and understanding consciousness. It made me ask questions, I don't have the answers yet, like, okay, if consciousness is a work of art, can we actually use what we know about the principles of aesthetics, for example, in trying to understand why consciousness has been developed and designed in the way it has been? We can ask questions about, do we have to learn to appreciate consciousness in the way in which, of course, we do have to learn to appreciate works of art produced by artists. A young child doesn't immediately see what art is about. And I think, again, the answer is we probably do have to learn to appreciate this miracle which we create ourselves. That's not to say It's not present for a young child, for example. I think it probably is. But the questions which we begin to ask about it are ones we have to learn by self-examination, and also, of course, by learning from kind of, the ways in which people throughout our community talk about the wonders of consciousness. So I said earlier that, okay, youngish children will ask questions about qualia, inversion, and so on, but I think it's not until we've become earlier and more sophisticated in the questions we ask that we begin to see how what we're delivering at that level of consciousness is this wonderful show which we put on, actually can make us ask even bigger and deeper questions about our relationship to the world, our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to other people. I mean, how come that I see you and Dimitri immediately, of course, as people are equally the hosts to this amazing performance. You are equally artists producing this stuff for your own appreciation and enjoyment, and that matters to you in the way it matters to me.
Beautiful. Just for specification, when you say that consciousness is an illusion, what exactly do you mean by illusion? Exactly.
Well, yes, exactly. What I mean is that we are attributing qualities to our experience which, in a sense, could not be what we think they are. Now, I've given an analogy. I use it rather often in my writings. You know this so-called Penrose triangle, the impossible triangle, okay, which we now know because Richard Gregory showed how to do it. You can actually make a real impossible triangle out of wood, it's designed so that if you look at it just from one particular point of view, you can't but see it as an impossible triangle existing out there in space, ready for you to touch. Well, nothing in the physical world could have the properties of an impossible triangle. It contravenes the laws of perspective and three-dimensional representation. So when I say that consciousness is an illusion, I mean it in that kind of sense. Okay, we are representing something as being what it could not be. It's different from what it is not, which is, of course, an illusion as well. I mean, if you put a stick into water and it seems to bend, of course, there could be such a thing as a bent stick. It just is wrong in that case. I think the illusion of consciousness is much more interesting than that. It is really an illusion of something which is an invention of a kind which could not be translated into any kind of material or physical model. Now, that's how the physical brain, we are no more than physics, can actually be responsible for generating representations of a non-physical world. And my answer, I never want to say that qualia don't exist. I mean, we use that shorthand, Dimitri, sometimes, but the qualia do exist and they're centrally important to our lives. But they are, to use another analogy, they can be important to us in the way in which, let's say, the idea of God can be important to us. Gods don't exist, but gods influence our lives in dramatic ways. Illusions can be very powerful. And so in my more recent work, I've been trying to show exactly why the illusion as we experience it could have there's major consequences for the way we lead our lives.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, thank you very much, you mentioned famous Penrose triangle and your analogy between our qualia and impossible physical objects. My question is, how did you invent that brilliant analogy between qualia and impossible physical object? It's your invention. How do you remember?
No, I don't remember.
Really? In your early works, I haven't seen this analogy. It's late.
Yeah, you're right, it is. I think, when did I use it? Yes, you're right. I don't know. Where do ideas come from? I mean, I'm sure the idea's probably been churning away in my head. Impossible fingers, they're everywhere in our culture, actually, now. When I first came across them, though, in the works of Escher, the lithographer, I mean, they were extraordinary novelties, and so we all had posters on our walls, and we got very excited by these bizarre, but nonetheless totally unambiguous illusions. I mean, unambiguous in the sense that you couldn't give any other interpretation to it than that there's something which doesn't make sense in three-dimensional space. I mean, okay, I don't know at what point I wanted first to apply that to the notion of qualia. Don't know.
Interesting. But another question, just for clarification. If I understand you correctly, you are a physicalist after all. So you are ready to identify qualia and brain state. So on brain state. So the question is,
identify, yes, but only in the sense we just talked about.
Yes, of course,
okay, yeah.
of course. But the question is, look at this table. I am sure that you agree that this table, this thing which you see now, is not the brain state.
You're coming on to a very important issue. In general, because sensations and perceptions occur in parallel, I perceive something as red or blue, yellow, at the same time as I sense it as being red or blue or yellow. Okay, the result is that after experiencing these conjunctions all the time, I actually can't help attributing qualia to the outside world. Now that's a category mistake. Qualia are not properties of the outside world; they're properties of my own mind. But I make that projection, and it's actually part of this whole story. Because I make those projections, the world itself, outside the physical world, is enchanted by my own mind. I begin to believe that these impossible, brilliant, wonderful qualities actually are part of nature out there. So, in a sense, well, what happens, I use this phrase, it must work in Russian too, the things out there are singing my song. Every time I taste a lemon or see the color yellow or feel a pain for that matter, it's all me. Those qualia are entirely mine, but I project them outside myself. Now, I said that being conscious changes our relationship with other humans and our sense of our own importance and so on. I believe one very important fact is it also transforms our relation with the physical world. It's if we kind of spread a kind of fairy dust over the world. You know, we live in the physical moment, we're told by physicists, in the instant. Consciousness takes that instant and expands it into, in a sense, another dimension, so that we seem to live in a time which outlasts the present, which isn't totally exhausted by what's happened in the microseconds, which physicists tell us is all there is. That's, yes, I talk about the thickness of consciousness in the sense that we've been given something which is so much more than the physical experience could be. We've been given something now, a kind of ball to hold in the air, ourself, our own creation, which we can sit and enjoy and extend in some ways, or actually in other cases we can diminish. I think one of the reasons why psychedelic drugs are so effective is that they actually thicken time even further. They draw it out, and there'll be a physiological explanation of that. I mean, I believe these qualia are being generated by loops, reactivating loops inside the brain, which are generating remarkable attractor states. I mean that in the mathematical sense. Now, which then we represent as having these qualities. But one simple thing which can happen is you can simply change the gain of these circuits so that they either last a long time or they last a relatively short time. I think what happens under the influence of LSD, for example, is actually this has been stretched further under the influence of some other depressing drugs, or actually in the case of real depression, when people say the world has lost its color and so on, it's been flattened. I think it's because the moment of consciousness is going back slowly towards the instant of physics.
Mm-hmm. So I'll continue the questions about explanandum. there are many theories of consciousness, and there are many explanations of consciousness, and there are even theories that explain why consciousness cannot be explained. But there seems to be no agreement about what is consciousness, and Chalmers famously identified the heart problem, and Dennett famously denied the heart problem. So, in your opinion, what is the explanandum? What needs to be explained?
Well, I think several things need to be explained. I think consciousness certainly is a kind of mixed category, even a mongrel category, Ned Block would say. So, and we can, if you want the simplest definition, workable definition of consciousness, it's what's available to introspection, what we know about what's going on in our own minds. Now, that embraces thoughts and perceptions and sensations and the whole family of mental states which we can access, apparently, as if with an inner eye. We can, humans at least, we can even talk about them and discuss them. And so, and these, that consciousness in that broad sense has a lot of different levels and a lot of different functions, I believe. To begin with, it's a purely practical ability. It's allowing us now to integrate different compartments of the mind by bringing them together, as it were, on one stage, and therefore be able to see connections and resemblances and so on. It becomes a very effective workshop, and if Stanislas Dehaene would call it the workspace of the brain. None of that involves phenomenology. You could have all that, and in fact, probably soon enough we will have all that in machines, which will be able to exploit consciousness, and I mean this now again, they're having access to these mental states to perform all sorts of useful functions. Another important function, of course, is not just that it enables us to our minds to work in a kind of cross-modular way, it also gives us insight into the fact that our minds do work like that. And one of the first and most important consequences of consciousness became, in the course of evolution, that this insight into how our minds worked gave us ability to predict our own behavior, but perhaps even more important, to predict the behavior of other human beings. Because I can use what we call a theory of mind now that I have this insight in order to understand what's going on in your mind, or at least to make a very good guess about it. And therefore, I can, as a social being, both collaborating with you, feeling for you and so on, but also in competition with you, I begin to have a tool for doing that, what I've called natural psychology, which is extraordinarily important. Come back again though, there's so far no qualia. I think that is a separate problem. I think it's, in fact, qualia arose through a new kind of design going on in the brain, which was in some sense independent of the other levels of consciousness I've talked about. And I think, but because people move backwards and forwards between consciousness in the broad sense of introspection and consciousness in the particular sense of sensory phenomenology, I think they talk at cross purposes a great deal. I mean, I think, for example, Stan Dehaene, in his wonderful new book called, what's it called? Anyway, it's called, The Conscious Brain, I think it is, in which he describes his brilliant experiments on the global workspace of the brain and so on. He denies in that book that there is anything to talk about beyond that. And he says that qualia are just a kind of diversion, something which was something which philosophy has introduced into the discussion, which we can do without, scientists can do without. I think he's just wrong about that. But he's right about everything else he's writing about, but he's just not addressed that problem. On the other side, many contemporary philosophers think the hard problem is the only important problem. And in fact, if we don't address the hard problem, we're not talking about consciousness. And I think Dave Chalmers these days, well, actually he talks about the easy problems and the hard ones, but he certainly thinks the hard one is the big goal for philosophy to get its mind around, and he, I think, thinks that science will never solve that problem. So, Dimitri, back to what's the explanandum? several explanandums. We mustn't confuse them, or we'll start. We'll think we're answering one question, when actually we're answering another one.
Mm-hmm. As a continuation, in some sense, of Dmitri's question, more specific question, while explaining your theory of qualia in your recent book, Soul Dust, you mentioned the strange loops of Hofstadter, his famous concept, as one of the sources of your theory. So my question is exactly in what degree your theory depends on Hofstadter's ideas, if ever.
I think it doesn't, to be honest.
Depends. Yes.
No, I saw Hofstadter's work as being fitting nicely with what I was saying, but I came up with this idea of these attractor states, which would have these strange self-referential properties, from actually talking to a physicist about feedback loops. Thanks. I was discussing, how feedback loops might be generating very interesting internal states in the brain, and a friend of mine said, "Well, yeah, okay. And do you know about delay differential equations?" No, of course I didn't know about delay differential equations, but delay differential equations are a mathematician's way of characterizing what happens in a feedback loop, which, when the gain of the circuit depends on the activity the previous time around. And they're well known because once that's happening, they generate very remarkable attractor states, states which develop and then become stable states of activity, which can remain intact for really quite a long time before perhaps they get disturbed and fade away. Now, these attractor states are not only interesting and beautiful, I'll show an example tomorrow, but they can have extraordinary mathematical and maybe metaphysical properties. For example, in order to describe them, you may have to have a space of many dimensions, and some of them can only be described in a space of an infinite number of dimensions. This is generated by a simple feedback loop. So, here, well, at least when I saw that, I thought, well, this is good. Here we've got, consciousness is going to require something pretty remarkable. Well, a space of infinite dimensions wouldn't be a bad start. I don't think we need infinite dimensions, but anyway, it put me on to thinking about these mathematical states as having a good way to go forward. And I refer, I think, in that book to perhaps the qualia as being mathematical objects. But I'm not a mathematician, and I'm not going to be able to deliver on that in the way I'd like to, though I'm already toying with some other nice ideas. For example, the holographic principle. Here's a nice analogy. A two-dimensional surface can represent something existing in 3 dimensions, an illusory 3-dimensional object. That happens with a hologram. We're all very familiar with them. You see them on credit cards and things. There's a principle in physics now, which is called the holographic principle, which says that any space of n dimensions can represent an illusory space of n plus 1 dimensions. So you've always got that extra dimension to play with, and it's what now physicists talk possibly. Well, it came up with the idea of black holes. Black holes, Stephen Hawking showed, everything which is inside the black hole can be represented by the surface of the black hole, so that when information seems to disappear into a black hole, which actually contravenes a very deep physical principle, you can argue it hasn't disappeared because it could exist as a hologram simply on the surface of the black hole. Now, maybe this isn't making a lot of sense, but physicists even suggest that maybe this world we now live in is actually, we're living in a hologram. Actually, this is all occurring in 2-dimensional space. Maybe it's only metaphorical, but I think it's, it means that when we're trying to provide physicalist explanations, we've got a pretty good vocabulary of concepts out there which make physics look much more kind of soft and romantic than it would be if we just meant, billiard balls or whatever it may be. I think people, why they're so offended by the idea that consciousness is generated by a purely physical system, it's because, they've just bought into this kind of Cartesian model of physics.
To continue my question about influences, I am especially interested in philosophers. Are there any philosophers at all who made an impact on your views?
At all? Yes, for sure. I never took a course in philosophy, but certainly, when I was a schoolboy, I read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, and I couldn't think which of all these wonderful philosophers I most wanted to be like. There was plenty of good models.
More specific, maybe, influences.
Yeah. No, I mean, more recently.
More recently.
More recently, of course, the one person who's influenced me most is Daniel Dennett. We got to know each other, I guess, 25 years ago now. And I'll tell you the thing, I hope Dan's not listening to this. When I first met Dan, at that point in my career, maybe I was 40 years old, I'd heard of people, scholars, who'd talked about the people who'd most influenced them and the great gurus whom they'd looked up to and sat at their feet. And I thought, and I had thought, here I am at 40, I've never met anybody who I would worship in that kind of way, who I'd say, was the most important influence in my life. Certainly I've met people I've learned from. When I first met Dan, I thought, look, here's the real thing. Dan could do everything I could do better, and a whole lot more. I mean, I don't just mean in terms of philosophy. I mean, he could play the piano better than I could. He could play tennis better than I could. Of course, I got to know some of Dan's limits later on, but nonetheless, he's remained my great philosophical hero. And it doesn't mean I don't disagree with him, but he is an extraordinary rarity, somebody who thinks so originally as a philosopher at the same time as understanding natural sciences in the way very few other philosophers do. So, okay, but then, of course, I'd say which philosophers have influenced me. I'm not sure I'm going to distinguish philosophers from scientists and artists and all the other creative minds which have gone before all of us. I think it's interesting, of course, that philosophy is being kind of not diluted, but much more dispersed nowadays. So there aren't the great heroes of the past. We don't have a Wittgenstein anymore, let alone an Immanuel Kant. We have a whole lot of people who are contributing to the wider picture, but not in those world-changing ways. So I think, in some sense, for students these days, it's disappointing that there's no one who they can say that, I'm going to be a Kantian or a Wittgensteinian or whatever it is. To be a Dennettian doesn't really kind of, that would be an odd thing to say, let alone a Humphrey. So I think, just as in every other area of scholarship, it's become more democratized in the sense, it's also the way scholarship works. It's partly due to Dmitry and others who bring these big figures in and set their ideas against each other and, in a sense, cut them down to size. But
returning to consciousness, in your papers on consciousness, you mentioned that one of the most important functions of consciousness is to attribute value to the human life. And in an argument for that, you provide an example of that lady you've spoke, recently, that had visual perception but couldn't experience vision as to the full degree as we do. So why do you think that this example, and if I understand it supports your argument, why do you think it does support? So the evolution, in my understanding, could have designed primates so they would have vision exactly like the patient you've mentioned, except that they would value it a lot, like normal.
Well, it could have done, and maybe it did, and the way it did it was providing this additional effect of consciousness experience. I'm not saying that we couldn't have come to have some of the values we do in a different way. I don't think our particular form of consciousness is the only possible way the job could have been done. It's the one which natural selection hit on, because I think the brain was ready for it. It could have been different. Maybe there are other ways of doing it. We're going to come up against that problem if and when we want to build this level of consciousness into robots. Now, you might wonder why we'd want to. And it's an important question. Why would we want to? I've at least speculated about this issue. But in the near future, we're going to want, or we're already beginning to explore the universe, not only beyond the Earth, but beyond the solar system. We're thinking now of sending human beings to Mars, for example. But in the longer run, when we want to make much longer journeys, we're going to have to send other creatures in our place, artificial creatures which we've designed in the laboratory. And we'll want them to report back on what they're discovering and so on. So they're going to have to be terribly intelligent and sensitive and curious. Really, the Mars robot is called Curiosity. But as we build those qualities, those intellectual qualities into these machines, we may come up against a problem, which I think nature came up against in designing humans, which is the possibility of existential anxiety. These robots are going to be speeding away out into space. They're probably never going to come home. They're going to ask, what am I doing here? What's this all about? And one possible thing we could do is to give them some intrinsic sense of self-worth and a pleasure even in the exploration of the universe, which couldn't come to a robot which was simply designed to just answer questions and not to dwell on its inner life. So I think we're going to have to give robots phenomenal consciousness for the same reason that nature gave it to us. It's to give us a greater sense of who we are. So we'll have these machines which we delegate to go out there on our behalf, but they're also going to value themselves in their own right. Now, when we do that, since we hope we will soon have a model for how to do it in a biological system, well, why not emulate that model? I mean, there may be some other ways of doing it, but we'll see.
When you suggested the phenomenal experience provide the grounds for creating self, you mentioned that it also provides grounds for the interest in survival. Mm-hmm. And I understand how consciousness can be ground for the value of certain states, but how can consciousness attribute special value to my states? I mean, conscious states are constantly changing. There should be a different reason for attributing special value to the states of the body in the future. So, what do you think of those grounds are?
Well, come back to your question about, you almost seem to ask it skeptically, can contribute to my valuing myself.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most significant things which consciousness does. It turns us into rampant individualists. I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that however much I believe in your consciousness and your consciousness, I don't directly experience it. It's a second-hand attribution. The only consciousness I know of is my own.
Why do you think that the conscious states that you experience now would be your conscious states in 10 years? How do you? What is the basis for the personal identity?
I think we've every empirical evidence for it. I go to sleep every night. What a dangerous thing to do. And children sometimes, panic about going to sleep because they think they'll never wake up. But I have always woken up in the last 70 years, and I've woken up to be the same self with the same memories and the same access and opinions and quirks that I was when I lost consciousness the night before. So, it looks as if the continuity of the self is actually an empirical datum. Now, and I think that's one reason why we can't quite believe in death, because why should death be so different? I mean, and of course, and in fact, across the world, people talk about dying as going to sleep. But it's, the tragedy is that this particular case, this black swan which comes along, you wake up and you're not, so you don't wake up from it. Your consciousness is gone forever this time around.
So what do you think is the meaning of life? Does it have a meaning?
I think, well, of course life has meaning. It has exactly, well, to begin with, it has exactly the meaning which nature has designed for it. I mean, this was an extraordinary new thing. Life doesn't have meaning for pre-conscious creatures, I don't think at all. We can attribute meaning to it. I don't think it had meaning for them. Once this consciousness, once these loops had joined up and we suddenly were living in this new universe of conscious sensation, I think life did acquire a meaning, the most obvious being that I want to carry on as I am. I want more of this. I want to be this bubble not to burst. That's a pretty strong sense of meaning. And then, of course, we can build all sorts of issues to do with survival of not only of ourselves, but of our loved ones and of our society and everything else. We can even believe that the survival of the planet as a whole, even without human beings, contributes meaning to our lives. I think it begins with the central fact that I want to go on.
We spoke before the interview a lot about Russia, and it seems that you have a lot of connection to Russian culture. So can you explain why and how did that start? Okay,
I don't have as much connection as I would like to. I haven't been here for 30 years anyway. Dimitri, like so many of my generation growing up, especially in post-war Europe, had felt a great debt to the Soviet Union for having saved us from Hitler and so on. You know, unlike American kids who actually think the Soviet Union didn't really have a role in the war, we knew deeply that we wouldn't have survived without it. So there was a great love and gratitude to Russia and things Russian. That at the same time, for reasons going far beyond earlier than the war, British culture is deeply riddled with Slavophilia. Russian novelists are the greatest novelists, as we were always taught and believed and came to experience. Russian history was exciting and dramatic. When I was growing up, I loved everything Russian, and I wanted to join the Communist Party to identify with what I thought were, this amazing civilization. I don't want entirely to deny that. I did love coming to Russia under the Soviet regime. I think the ideals of life were really truly present there, which have been lost. There was a kind of kindness and connection between people. I'll tell you an anecdote. I remember so many years ago being in a restaurant in Leningrad, and suddenly the doors flung open, and a distraught-looking man, straight out of Dostoevsky, came in with a bunch of flowers. Mm-hmm. And he went up to a table with a man and a woman there, and he knelt and he pushed them towards the woman. She picked them up, threw them away. He kind of collapsed on the floor. Everybody in the restaurant stopped eating and everything else. Half the group concentrated on the girl, half concentrated on the man who'd just come in, helping him, commiserating, trying to understand, looking after him. And, the same happened in America, or if that mattered in Britain. Everybody would leave at the first possible, to get out of the way at the first possibility. They'd be so embarrassed by this demonstration of emotion which was going on. And in America, probably, some thought that they might be sued if they did anything about it. So that's, perhaps I like to believe that kind of event would still occur here in Moscow, but I think it's slightly less likely. I think that kind of sense of comradeship doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, and our last question. Could you tell us something about your current project, scientific project, or maybe philosophical projects?
Well, they're the same project I've been on for the last 40 years, I guess. I'm trying to get closer to an answer to the nature of phenomenal experience. I've got some ideas, which I'll talk a bit about tomorrow, which I haven't published. I'm not writing another book.
Not right.
No, not at the moment. I've now written 6 books on consciousness, which is too many. But every time, of course, I thought, well, this can be the last one because the problem will be solved. And then, for reasons I don't really understand, the world didn't respond like that, saying, okay, problem solved, now we can all go home. And so then, of course, I realized that I've got to do the job again and do it better. my ambition, I guess for a very long time, has been to get an answer to these problems before I die.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure.